get started.
You gonna start?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I don't know if that.
Okay. So welcome everyone to this session on decolonizing international journalism. That is a big loaded term, and we will dive into exactly what it means in just a minute. My name is Hiba Ali. I am the CEO of the New Humanitarian, which is an independent nonprofit newsroom that covers humanitarian crises, as the name might suggest, around the world. So that's conflict, disasters, epidemics, refugees, but also the way that the world responds to these crises. And as many other newsrooms around the world, we were, I think, impulsed by the murder of George Floyd in 2020 to think a little bit deeper and harder about just the way we do our work. George Floyd's murder, and actually an Indian colleague of mine, he said, why was it that it took the murder of George Floyd to have this awakening? You know, there were many other murders of people around the world, and nobody paid attention. And that's yet another example of just how kind of Western-centric our lens is. But for better or for worse, his murder did prompt a racial awakening around the world. But in the news context, a lot of the conversations about racial justice were really limited to national context. So how does the US better represent Latino and Black communities in its reporting? There were discussions in the UK. How can the British media better represent the public? What was missing, we felt, was a conversation at the global scale. What does it mean to do international journalism differently in the wake of this discussion about racial justice? And so to what extent do international media represent the people that they report on? And that is actually, in many ways, I like to think, a more complicated problem. Shirish may disagree with me, but you know, does the whole notion of the foreign correspondent even make sense anymore? But more deeply than who is producing the journalism, you know, how do we go about deciding what stories are told and through what frame and for which audience? So that's what we're talking about today. This was particularly relevant for our organization because of the topic we cover. It is one that is rife with what we call parachute journalism. And I think in reflecting on this question of decolonization, we got feedback from some people saying, for instance, you know, you cover, basically our beat is death and destruction, right? Is that really representative of the people that we're covering? Is that the story that those communities want told about them? And within the context of these crises, how can we tell a different and more comprehensive story? So last year, we were drafting a new strategy, and we set out to look at this. How do we decolonize our journalism? What does it mean to be a truly global, cosmopolitan news organization, truly serving global audiences? Really hard problem to solve for many reasons, which we'll talk about. And through that process, we had a lot of conversations and consultations with, including all of the people on this panel who've been helping us think through this question. And we wanted to then share that reflection more broadly with you, and hopefully also have you help us with our reflection as well. We're putting together, I'm going to make the same joke, but it's not a white paper, it's a paper. We can call it a black paper or a rainbow paper, to try to put together our takeaways from all of these reflections, and will be, so you can look out for that, which will hopefully take into account some of these discussions and try to put into one place some ideas around how we tackle this moving forward. So I'm going to just introduce everyone who's here with us, and I want to thank you in advance because you have been part of helping us think things through. Lashmi Parthasarathi is the Chief Operating Officer at Global Press, which is an international news organization that has tried to address this problem by training and employing local reporters and building up local news for local audiences. Dina Abu Ghazala is an Egyptian media entrepreneur. She spent many years at the BBC and then founded her own media startup that helps local journalists place their content in international media and try to fill that gap on mentorship and entry to barriers to entry. And she'll tell you a little bit more about why there are some double standards that play in there. And Shirish Kulkarni is a community organizer, an award-winning journalist, and a researcher. He leads the Bureau of Investigative Journalism's Decolonizing the News project in the UK, but also works on something called the People's Newsroom, which he will also tell you a little bit more about. So I want to start by asking each of you for your definition of what it means, what decolonizing the news means, because that term, as I said, is very loaded and everyone kind of interprets it in their own way. I don't think there needs to be one single definition, but let's try to build out what it is that we're talking about when we talk about decolonizing the news. Sharish, maybe I can start with you.
Yeah, so I think what I always say about this stuff is I don't know what I'm doing. Like, we're in a space where we're experimenting every day, we're finding new stuff out every day. And so I accept that language is imperfect. But I think what we're talking about when we're decolonizing the news is flipping stuff from, and I owe Patrick from The Elephant this actually, I know this is more a really good example, he's here now. It's like the journalism where you're imposing perspectives, right? And as an example of the problem, I'm just going to read, so some of a kind of well-known Financial Times journalist, it's my glasses I need, not the mask, a well-known Financial Times journalist wrote a critique of Semaphore, the new kind of publication or whatever it will be, by the guys Smiths from Bloomberg and New York Times, which is not going to have foreign correspondents. And he wrote, it's supposed to be a critique that I don't have anything to worry about. A foreign correspondent isn't vital because he or she knows more than a local, but because he or she is representing the audience. An ambassador with similar frames of reference and an instinct for what's surprising, unique, shocking, or entertaining about a news event. Right, so every single word of that is wrong. Because actually, the whole point is your perspectives are wrong. You don't understand the place, you don't understand the people, you don't understand the story when you kind of jump into these places. But that is what we're facing, and the thing I've learned actually is that we're not going to solve this through kind of legacy, through news organisations, through that decolonising the news perspective. People love to come into the conversation. They love saying they come to the conversation. When you said this is what you need to do, which actually means giving up power, they didn't want a piece of that. That's too hard. So I think that's what it is. It's about the journalism of imposing perspectives and flipping that where we hear new perspectives.
I will just push back on the Ben Smith, Justin Smith venture, and we've had a number of discussions with Gina Chow, who's here, the new executive editor, and it is meant to be this revolutionary thing serving global audiences as though this is the first time that anyone attempts to do that. And I'll just say there are many of us who've been trying to do that for quite some time. And maybe two white men who come from legacy media are not best placed to set up such a venture. But I do think Gina's coming at it with some good intentions, so it'll be interesting to see.
There are plenty of critiques on it. That is not it.
Yeah. Just before we hear from Dina and Lashmi, you kind of alluded to it, but you were at this panel yesterday, I guess it was, on diversity dividends, which seems to have rubbed you the wrong way. So maybe you should tell us a little bit about what happened.
Yeah, so the panel was called the Diversity Dividend, and it was about the business case for diversity, right? And I asked a question. I said, why do we have to have a business case for diversity? Because what you're saying is the journalism industry does not accept the moral argument that people are equal. And so why should I trust an industry which doesn't fundamentally believe people are equal? And it was pretty much shut down. Like the moderator said, oh, well, that's a very provocative question. If you're going to call your panel a diversity dividend, you're going to have to accept questions, expect questions about what you mean by that. And that is an industry in which I have lived and worked for 25 years and has treated me really badly, actually. And when people push back and say, oh, yeah, no, but it's good to have a business case for it. But I say, if you don't accept the moral argument, then what does the journalism look like? What kind of journalism do you make if you don't accept the argument that people are fundamentally equal?
I raised that because when you talked about kind of, you don't think the change is going to come from the big institutions, that's what you're up against. Dina, how do you define decolonizing, particularly international journalism?
Yes, thank you. So for me, decolonizing the media is more about removing this top-bottom approach that's happening at the moment. Because at the moment, international media, when it wants to cover, I'll focus mainly about my part of the world, which is the Middle East and Africa. So it's totally okay for international media to send a correspondent who doesn't speak Arabic, for example, and have never lived in Egypt or maybe stayed a couple of days or weeks, to be the expert and to, and you as audience in Western capitals, you'll be listening to what they have to say as the expert. But this is the point. Imagine, a non-Western country, China or Russia, sending a correspondent to London, not speaking English, to report on Brexit, which is a very complicated topic. Would you trust their coverage? Most of the time, the answer is no. So why is it that you have to trust that correspondent when he or she do not have enough awareness of the culture or the local language? And at the same time, to be a Middle East correspondent, you don't need to speak Arabic, right? And you don't even need to bother to have lived there, okay? You can just do it from Twitter, which is a completely unrepresentative, platform for the majority of people who live in that area. If you flip that, if someone is interested, and this is a real scenario without naming the name of the broadcaster, so there was this advertisement for one of the top European broadcasters looking for someone to work in their Arabic service, okay? But one of the preconditions was that they had to know the language of that broadcasting company, which is not English. So you have all these barriers of entry for local journalists in our region, because actually for someone, from example in Egypt, to be able to speak English, that's in itself an indication that they have been privately educated. Because the majority of people who've been educated in public schools would not have the level of language that will enable them to this. So this is already limiting the pool. It's a very elitist thing. So you're getting also the views of the elite of what's going on in our part of the world. So actually, changing who is telling the news, changing what kind of stories. I worked before establishing IAB, as Hiba mentioned, I worked for the BBC, and it's not just at the BBC, but everywhere. There's a sort of a predetermined agenda of what stories matter from our part of the world. So yes, climate and environment now is a sexy topic, and everyone's got, but 10 years ago it wasn't. So if I want to pitch a story about environment, but if I would pitch a story about women oppression, forced marriage, LGBTQ community, then immediately it gets up. And I'm not saying these topics should not be in the news. They should, but they're not the only topics. So this is the point. What happens is that international media focuses on certain topics and keeps repeating and repeating, and this gives you only part of the reality of what's going on in the world. So that Africa is reduced to poverty, the Middle East is reduced to terrorism, human rights violations, because this is what you get to see over and over and over. So this is another form of decolonization. And also, when we start trusting the people to tell us, okay, what kind of stories that matters also for them to be told. And I think also, where are we looking for stories? So we have the business model currently is built on the fact that we think more capitals, cities are more important than others. So, okay, we'll have these people in Dubai, in Cairo, but we don't care about what's going on, for example, country X. I don't want to use any country so no one feels offended. But who said that what's happening in Cairo is more important than what's happening in that country? And I understand the business reasons for this, because you can't have people in every city, but you have local journalists in every city. Why can't you invest in training them, empowering them, mentoring them, so they give you their stories? And we can go forever. There is also pay, disparity in pay, and again, real stories, major broadcasters. I'll give you, the last example is that we have this real story where a journalist in Yemen was offered 150 euros to do a 2-minute video report. A friend of mine, for a European broadcaster based in Berlin, was offered to do 1,800 euros to deliver a 2-minute video report. Why? And please don't tell me it's because living in Yemen is much cheaper, it costs less than Berlin. Because guess what, when someone from Germany is sent to for example, let's say you can have someone stationed in Yemen, they will not get paid like Yemenis. They'll still get paid the European standards. Thank you.
Lashmi, Global Press was created in part to, tell us why it was created. What problem were you trying to solve for?
So
And speak.
we cannot talk about decolonizing global media without addressing, the why. Like, why have we built this global press model? 3 reasons. We need to question, who is the storyteller? Who is the audience? And what words are we using to represent the communities and people that we cover? And what are the consequences of using the wrong words, of not representing them in local languages? And that needs to be driven by local people with historical context, with nuance, with incredible source access. And global press was really started to counter this problem of essentially parachute journalism, people coming in for a short period of time, not understanding the context and nuances of a place, of complex issues, and local reporters being right there and available to tell these stories, but not having high quality jobs, not having duty of care, safety and security support, not having the byline, frankly. And so the global press model is all about building representative news bureaus in local communities, staffed, so these are employed reporters by global press, and they are local reporters. And so, when we talk about who is the reporter, we need to look at barriers to entering the journalism industry. In some countries we operate in, you need to go to a certain university, you need to graduate with a certain certificate in order to get press accreditation. There are tribal affiliations in some places where you have to belong to a certain community that is of a high caste or class in order to get promoted within the newsroom. There are all sorts of things that we need to understand and deconstruct in terms of representation and building healthy media markets in these, all over the world, frankly. So this isn't just about, looking at local audiences and local news. We are served by better local journalism. And I say we, sitting in the United States. We are served by better local journalism sitting in the UK and Australia and Canada, all over the world. Because if we perpetuate these narratives around war, poverty, disaster, and disease, and we don't invest in the whole story, which can only be told over a long period of time, not when that earthquake happens, 6 years later. What's happening in terms of rebuilding efforts? What's the government's response? And when everyone parachutes back out, local reporters are still there telling those stories. So decolonization of global media means rethinking the entire model and creating a systems change for journalism. And that's what global press is doing.
I hope she doesn't mind me quoting her on this, because I don't know that she meant to tell the whole world, but your CEO said it once to me in a way that has stuck with me forever, which is stories are about people that they are not for. Stories are about people that they are not for. The Nick Kristof coverage doesn't serve anyone. It misrepresents a group of people to elite audiences. So I think that's a helpful way of thinking about it as well. At the New Humanitarian, we've come to define it, decolonizing journalism, as 2 things. So first, and it kind of combines, we cheated by basically not zeroing in on one thing, combines everything, being inclusive of service to and guided by the communities that we cover, meaning that our reporters and editors better represent the people they report about, but also that the communities that we serve are playing a role in shaping which stories we tell. So to your point, Dina, about, why are we the ones deciding what's important? But it's also other things like being guided by communities means, as I was saying at the beginning, maybe they don't want to see only death and destruction, so more constructive or solutions journalism. It means telling stories that represent people in their agency. So we've done, our executive editor, Josephine Schmidt, is here, and she's made a big effort to, even in small things like headlines, change from so-and-so was forced to flee to so-and-so managed to flee. In other words, like they took some agency and power in determining the future of their lives. These are tiny little changes that really do, we hope, kind of reflect a different agency among the people that we are writing about. Then the second piece is decentering Western and colonial narratives and approaches in the way we produce our journalism, in the way we report it, in the way we disseminate it. And this is where I think it gets quite tricky. But I want to show you guys a little clip that maybe will help illuminate some of this. It's about the coverage of Ukraine. And I think what it does is give us a perfect case study of how media that consider themselves to be international are really writing and broadcasting for a very Western audience in some of the implicit things they say that tell us who they consider to be their audience. So have a look at some of these highlights. Let me see.
A lot of people on TV didn't expect a war like this to happen in, let's say, certain neighborhoods.
This is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
These are prosperous middle-class people. These are not people trying to get away from areas in North Africa. They look like any European family that you would live next door to.
What could be a difference here from other conflicts, that could seem very far away, in Africa or Middle East or whatever. I mean, these are Europeans that we're seeing being killed.
This isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen.
I've watched these clips like 100 times, and every time I'm just like, what are you doing? So right there you see, they think they are speaking to people who look like us. That doesn't include, frankly, any one of us on this panel because we're not blue-eyed and white-haired, blonde-haired. Yeah, we are white-haired, actually. And so is this truly international coverage? So the racism is one piece of it. The other piece that's I'll just put this back up, worth noting is just the sheer quantity, right, of Ukraine coverage compared to any other crisis. You can see there the spike that overshadows Yemen. You can argue it's been running for a long time. Ethiopia, a relatively new conflict. Afghanistan, which for many years was the focus of Western coverage. Even the Taliban takeover is tiny in coverage compared to Ukraine. And so again, why do we care more about Ukraine as international media if we are truly serving global audiences? So for us, just coming back to how we define decolonizing journalism, it is de-Westernizing who we see as our audience, and then inculcating in every sentence we write, basically, an understanding of that Western hegemony, sorry, and white supremacy, frankly. And so Josephine gave a great example earlier this morning about coverage of Haiti, and often people will say, this is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. Do they explain why it's the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere? Because of decades of exploitation and extraction, a crippling debt to France, et cetera, et cetera. And until we're willing to call that out, we're not really giving the full picture. We had a private convening this morning about this topic with a handful of people, and we realized that we're kind of talking about different problems. So I think it's probably just worth drilling down on, there is one problem, which is the lack of quality local journalism for local audiences. It's part of the problem you're trying to solve. There is a problem of lack of quality global journalism about different parts of the world for global audiences. That's part of the problem you're trying to solve. And then across all of that, there's a problem that the journalism isn't created by or with communities, and that's part of the problem you're trying to solve. So I just want to acknowledge that this isn't a single problem. It's a number of different pieces of the puzzle. So maybe we can kind of come back to let's talk about the how. How do you actually go about? So we've talked about what it means to decolonize. How do you operationalize that? Can you give us a couple examples from your work as to how you're trying to solve this problem? Back to you, maybe, Shirish.
Sure. So the People's Newsroom Initiative is UK-based, but actually a lot of the lessons and learnings we hope, kind of apply to the rest of the world, but also feed into the conversation about the rest of the world. Because what I'd say to start off with is my just overarching critique of foreign correspondent work, right, for international reporting, is we start from the perspective, as per that tweet of, look how different we are. And actually, what would journalism look like if it started from, look how the same we are? Because like in the UK, for example, we have this enormous, except when it's from Ukraine, anti-refugee, anti-migrant discourse, which comes from journalism, right? That comes directly from journalism. It's not other civil society stuff, it's journalism, right? We would all be on that boat across the channel if we'd lived in that situation or had to, had managed to flee from that situation. But the media discourse in the UK doesn't allow people in the UK to think that way, unless the discourse changes to what it's doing about Ukraine. So what we've been doing is we are lowering the barriers, or trying to lower the barriers to entry for anyone, any people and communities to tell their own stories in the way they want to tell them. And that's not our idea, that we asked people all over the UK what they wanted to see from the future of media. And largely what they said, as we discussed, was like, I'm not going to get that from mainstream media. They've had their chance for the last 100 years, and they've messed it up every time. Yeah, we were doing a pilot with people in Swansea, so like in Wales, where I live, people of colour largely, working class largely, and they're like, yeah, the media does not serve us. You know, young Muslim women telling us, we open the newspaper with a feeling of trepidation, of fear, because of how my people in my community are going to be covered, right? And that's a business decision, as discussed before as well, to harass, misrepresent, and to attack Muslim people. So actually what they tell us is we want to tell our own stories. And it doesn't matter if that's just telling our own stories to ourselves. It doesn't really matter if anyone else wants to listen. We want to tell the stories of what our community really is. And so storytelling is easy, right? 30,000 years of human history have told us you don't need a one-year postgrad diploma in journalism to learn how to tell stories, right? Journalists pretend it's much more complicated than that. Everyone can tell stories, right? What the difficult thing is actually making that sustainable, the economics of it, the kind of back office stuff, the marketing, the platform, the legal stuff. So we are decentering ourselves as journalists, saying we're going to give you that infrastructure, a centralized infrastructure that means that newsrooms can set up all over the UK to make that possible. And we get different stories. They tell us different stories about the way the world is. And actually, those are stories that actually could be heard by anyone in the UK, and would tell them a very different story. And like in the other half of my life, apart from doing kind of community engagement work, I do research on how we tell better news stories. And actually, it's by giving people context. Yeah, as we talked about with Haiti. It's by giving them agency. It's by helping people understand the world better. And we had a really fascinating conversation in another panel about, we need to call what we're doing, like meeting people's information needs, something different, because journalism is like this weird thing. And I actually said, do you know what? We're the ones doing journalism. It's the mainstream media that's doing something different, whether you call it entertainment or propaganda or whatever. They need to change their name. They're not going to, but what we're doing is journalism.
So helping people tell their own stories, Dina, what are some of the ways you are trying to tackle this problem?
Okay, so to answer this question, let me start just very briefly to go to what are the barriers for international media. So when I spoke to editors about why aren't you, allowing local journalists to tell you the stories of their own communities, they always cited two reasons. One is objectivity. We need someone, when you have this foreign eye, you're objective, you don't have stakes in what's going on. Let's all agree this is colonial legacy, because this is only applied when things happen in our part of the world, but not when there is a very polarizing US election. No one says, okay, let's get an Egyptian to cover it, to make sure she doesn't have a stake in what's going on. So that's it, we ignored it. But the second reason they cited was for us made some sense, which is the quality. We really struggle to get high quality local journalism that's up to our standards. And it's true, because if you look and take
our standards, who's our?
I'm saying their voice. They're in the international media standards, whether, CNN, BBC, they have certain standards. They can't find people, so in their voice. Anyway, and it's And I can understand this because in our part of the world, it's true in general, again, because there are always exceptions. But in general, public education is poor quality, really. You'd have people graduate without the basic skills of like fact-checking, all these skills that are needed to be able to do proper journalism. So, and that's why just giving them training and leaving them, giving training is important, but then there is the problem of that the local media scene is also very poor. So unlike in Western countries where you have local media outlets act as a training ground for aspiring journalists, where you go and work, and then you go up the ladder to a national media outlet and then an international. We don't have this. If you go to the local media outlet, actually you'll pick up very bad habits. You'll get stuck there. And what's happening is that we're seeing many of the good calibers just leaving the industry altogether because they think this is not what we signed up for. And then we're stuck with, I don't want to use it badly, like we're stuck with very few people who don't develop. And that's why this whole training model, as much as it's needed, but it's not enough. So you need, because what happens after the training? And then there we have the third problem is that pay, right? Very poor pay, and that's why, again, another reason many people are leaving the journalism industry in the local media scene. So what our model was based on, okay, so let's provide, like, personally, I didn't study journalism for my undergrad. I later on did a master's, but I really learned everything I learned from when I was employed by the BBC. And I was lucky because I spoke English, because I went to private schools. Okay, so yes, I was privileged. But I learned journalism from the fact that I was given constant feedback from my editors, okay? So the first, I don't know, couple of years, my pieces were horrible, and at the time, were still printed out things, and I remember my editor had all these notes, and I would go feel, oh my God, maybe I was not meant for this job, and then over the years, I developed, and this is how I reached that level I am now. It's not because I was born talented. Okay, I loved telling stories, but I learned, someone trained me and invested in teaching me, okay? So, but this is what's missing for local journalists. So I said, okay, let's create this sort of a virtual newsroom for them, where they pitch their ideas to us and we guide them through until they are able to get published in international media. So we take them on this journey where we give them constant feedback, and even if we're not gonna work on that idea because it doesn't work, but we tell them why so that they can go and do better. And then that's very beneficial for the international media because they get access to unique stories, because our premise is that locals have access to untold stories. You don't have to copy what's on the wires, okay, and because this is what's happening in the audience. People are telling you, I see a story here in CNN and BBC and AP, and it's everywhere. There's nothing new. So there's a lot happening in our world, but you need locals to tell you there's something happening on. So you get access to original stories, and like in the middle, kind of like reassure the concerned Western editor that, okay, relax, we'll fact check this, we are training them so you will get like the decent quality you're looking for. And yes, so this is what we've been doing. We've been taking them on the journey, starting from the idea until the delivery. And the result is that the local journalists get bylines. So they are building their CV, right? Because at the end of the day, the CV of the journalist is where have you been published before, right? And so we're helping them build their CV, build their capacity, because throughout the process, they're learning, because really, journalism is about practice. So learning by doing. You keep doing and getting feedback. And we haven't reached that level yet, although we have, actually, with the new Humanitarian, we have a very talented Lebanese journalist who published her first piece ever. We're not speaking that.
I didn't even know that.
Ever.
Wow.
And now she's on the long list of the One World Media Awards for a piece she did for the new Humanitarian. And guess what? I actually even connected her with the editor because we told her, Zainab, you're ready to go. Because it's our model. We don't want to own the journalist forever. We want to be a launch pad. So yeah, stay with us as long as you need, until you've had enough bylines, enough confidence in your skills, and then off you go. Fly on your own, okay? You've had enough bylines to back your case and move. And our hypothesis, but this is the longer term thing, is hopeful. After enough time, this model will contribute to having a new generation of very high quality local journalists who either then go ahead, of course, and occupy, positions in established media outlets, but we're hoping for some of them would actually go back to their communities and start their own media ventures, and this will lead to elevating the quality of local journalists, because usually the discussion about local journalism, like in a country like Egypt, is focused on press freedoms, which is very important, but even if we're the best country in the world when it comes to press freedom, what will happen? We need high quality, well-trained journalists so that it doesn't end into chaos. So that's
and it's
our model.
interesting that you pointed to that, because yesterday I was talking to someone from New Narratives who is here in Perugia, and she was saying this is exactly the problem. The minute you do have local journalists of high quality, they get scooped up and off they go into the international media, and then they again have basically ripped the intellectual capital from the local media scene. So I suppose that's also part of what you're trying to do. So tell us, sorry, I just want to say one last thing about your model, because something you said during our consultations resonated a lot, is that we're expecting the local journalists to be at the standard of an international journalist, but we're not willing to invest in that mentorship.
And
so
we as international media, not me, we as IGAP.
But also that if you flipped it, and you've kind of alluded to this, this isn't a great way of thinking about it, but an international journalist supposedly brings these skills and quality, right? And great knowledge of English and all these things, but doesn't have the local context. The local journalist does have the local context, and yet we also want them to have all the so you can't have your cake and eat it too, and you accept having only part of the cake when it comes to the international journalist, but you don't when it comes to the local journalist.
On that though, I'd say, look, there's not like an international standard. Like, is the product working so amazingly? Like, we're in a crisis, right? That people don't trust the journalism that mainstream media. Like, so is that a standard to be aspired to? Actually, don't we want to hear different ways of telling stories? Like, so we're not, that whole standards thing, the whole objectivity thing, it's all nonsense.
And I think, I want to come to you in a second, Lashmi, but one of the reframes or mindset changes that I think needs to happen is, what is a good story? And is a good story what is sexy and will appeal to large audiences? Is a good story what's going to win awards? Or is a good story what really serves communities? And you put it this way, journalism is a service industry. We need to see it as a service industry. And when you do that, it changes everything.
Well, and we have to be, is this on? We have to be brave enough and courageous enough to serve audiences that we can't monetize.
But how? What's the business model?
To serve those audiences, I hope there's funders in this room. This is what we need to be investing in. The local approach. We've been around for 16 years at Global Press building this model. It's refreshing that we're having this conversation right now, but it's like 16 years we've been trying to push this conversation of the local audience matters. And if we focus on that local audience, we serve the global audience. We serve every one of us sitting in this room, privileged enough to be in Perugia today, to learn about all other parts of the world through different lenses. So, the way Global Press has approached this, I've told you a little bit about our model, but, again, who do we serve as our audience is critical. How we write our stories, how we produce our stories. From the very beginning, we have a non-assignment policy in our newsroom. So no editor is telling a reporter, go find me an Ebola story. Reporters are able to tell the stories that are of consequence in their communities. Reporters like Marisa Revilla, who have been with us for 15 years in Chiapas, Mexico, training reporters like Marisa Revilla over many years of her career does produce exceptional journalism for her community in Chiapas, Mexico, but for all of us who get to learn about her community through that lens. The words that we use matter immensely. So at Global Press, we've developed the Global Press Style Guide, which is a counterpart to the Associated Press, but our prioritization is dignity and precision in word choice. So, Hiva, I am thrilled that we changed the original name of this panel.
This panel was called decolonizing coverage of the Global South. And Lashmi was like, Heba, I need to talk to you.
So we're not trying to be the word police with the style guide, but the idea is, what do we mean when we use terms like Global South and developing world? They're sanitized synonyms for poverty. They force people to make assumptions. They are meaningless if they're forcing people to make assumptions. So we actually did a nationwide, in the United States, audience study. This was a significant undertaking with a third party, and surveyed US citizens to understand what they took away from the term Global South and developing world. 0% of respondents could tell us what those terms meant. And in this community, we use them over and over and over again, and they're meaningless to our audiences. So we have to ask ourselves, who is our audience? Who are we serving? And what are the consequences of forcing people to make assumptions about large swaths of land?
So what's your alternative term?
Use more words. It's simple. Use more words. So we are conditioned as journalists over decades in a system that was about the printing press, deadlines, say it in fewer words, right? This is good journalism. We're no longer in that world anymore. If the consequences of not understanding a place are a few more words, that's much better than a border potentially closing because people don't understand what area of the world you're talking about, or the consequences of people not understanding, ethnic is another one of my favorites here. We all have, at least I do, aunts and uncles, that say, oh, I just had some wonderful ethnic food. Different, other than what, right? Again, another generalization. So
What's the frame of reference that
right,
you're starting
what's the
from?
frame of reference? Don't force your readers to make assumptions. Use more words and prioritize dignity and precision above all else. If people don't see themselves in the stories that are being told, they can't trust that journalism. We've all been talking about this. They can't trust it. So the style guide is available for free online at globalpressjournal.com, and really encourage people to leverage that tool, to talk to us about that tool. We want people to elevate and raise standards of international reporting by, leveraging a tool like the Global Press Style Guide.
I want to just delve a bit into, or not so much push back, but inquire about this hypothesis that a story that is good and useful and relevant to a local audience is also relevant for the international audience. And I ask because, the problem that we're all talking about here is based on, as you say, the business model, right? So Western audiences are paying for the news, and so the news is made for them. And certain audiences of the world can't be monetized, and so we ignore them. And if you can actually find a model in which the same story that Western audiences are willing to pay for is actually good for local communities, that's a very revolutionary transformation. But I'm not sure that it's always true that the story that is of service to a local community is the story that is of interest to the international audience.
And that's what needs to change. We can't. So what you just shared, Heba, is about finding interest, serving essentially the Western audience. We're saying, is it interesting to you? Are we serving you? They are benefiting from learning about those local stories. For example, I was telling Heba about this earlier, but our reporter in Democratic Republic of Congo in Kirumba, DRC, Merve Kavira Lunege, has told incredible stories about internally displaced people in her community. I guarantee you the kind of stories that someone else coming in for a short period of time is going to tell for that international audience might be shifted and changed to pique their interest. It's not serving anyone. It's not serving the local audience because they probably can't read it. It'll only be published in English. It's not serving us as the global audience or the US audience or the UK audience or whoever we are, because we have no idea what the full truth is, what the full story is. When an earthquake happens, when some other crisis happens, we go in for a short period of time, we tell that story, and that's what we believe that place to be about.
But how do we avoid it being like, eat your vegetables, like read this really nuanced, sophisticated, responsible journalism that isn't like interesting enough to pique your interest naturally.
But it's also a kind of, in a way, we're taking the concept of local as what's been given to us, right? So like the community we're working with in Swansea, like they're Bangladeshi, they're Somali, whatever, like they're not doing local news. What they care about is like what's happening in Bangladesh, Somalia, as well as what's happening in Swansea. And actually they stood straight away, we want to do stories about what's happening in Bangladesh and Somalia, but through a kind of UK-focused lens, but tell it in a more, you know, a way that's more understanding of all the context. And so it's sort of counterintuitive, but it goes back to the us, doesn't it, as well? Who is the us? That actually, you know, I live in the UK, but when they talk about us, they're not talking about me, even though they're doing it for a UK audience. So maybe I want to hear something different, which actually reflects how I look at the world, not how actually a very small proportion of the world look at. We were talking about earlier, I call it in London, in the UK, there's a particular area of London, which is quite middle class, posh, whatever, and disproportionately, the people who make television news live in that area, right? And they're disproportionately white, male, middle class, straight, cis, able-bodied, etc. So they make news by the people of Ealing, for the people of Ealing, except it's got a national and global platform. Those people are like, what, 5% of the population? They're making news for 5% of the population. We could be making news for 100% of the population.
But can you? I think that's the thing. What we're talking about here is you want news that represents you. Dina wants news that represents her. Lakshmi wants, and there is no one news that's going to represent all of us necessarily.
Are we assuming?
Yeah,
are we assuming we know what other audiences want, right? So in the United States, we have huge diaspora communities, migrant communities that we're not serving right now. They want news that is from their local communities as well, right? The world is so connected now. It's so different than it ever was.
But it also does suggest a more niche, bespoke, decentralized, you know, that there isn't one. I mean, this is the question we're asking. Is there such a thing as one global media that's going to serve everyone? And obviously,
where are we now?
The death of mainstream media is an answer to that. I'll just say that for us, one of the ways, so, you know, we've each presented, I think, ways we're trying to address this problem. One that's central for us at the New Humanitarian is thinking about impact. And so if journalism is meant to serve people, by telling this story, what impact are we seeking to have? And so rather than how do I reach the largest audience, or how do I make people care, because I think we often get stuck in that, right? Like, how do we make people care, and which people and about what? That we're saying, how do we help? Our mission is to contribute to improving the lives of people affected by crises by building an understanding about how best to do that. So how does this story, what is the potential for this story to contribute to that kind of impact? And sometimes that'll mean that the people who need to read the story are the local communities because they're the ones best placed to help themselves. Sometimes it'll be a European policy issue, as is the case in asylum policies we're seeing in Europe with so many borders closed. And then those are the people we need to reach for that story to have an impact that will then serve the people that we're ultimately serving. So I think there is a kind of a layer of sophistication that goes into then kind of being really granular about that question, which makes, of course, the job much harder because you're trying to serve many different audiences at once.
No, so I just wanted to give an example which actually covers that and like a whole bunch of other stuff we've just talked about. So there's an organisation called Unbiased the News, who some of you may have heard of, who I massively recommend. But they did a story kind of near the beginning of the pandemic, and in the UK and lots of other kind of Western countries, there's this whole thing about people from certain communities aren't getting the vaccine, and what the narrative of that was that actually they're too educated, they're superstitious, they're all these things, right? And actually, Unbiased the News did a story about a Pfizer trial in Nigeria, 94, I think it was, where actually it was a kind of done completely unethically, and actually wasn't at a place where they should do a trial. People died, children were deformed, people got brain damage as a result, and they had to pay billions in compensation, ultimately, like many years later, right? But then when you start to hear about that, and again, that, you know, that helps the rest of the world understand, you know, there's Nigerian diaspora in the UK. If you say to them, why are you taking the vaccine? They say, I know about this stuff, right? So that's an entirely rational decision which we would all make in that situation. So we're helping everyone understand the world, and the impact is helping those communities not be kind of marginalized and kind of vilified. It's actually saying, look, the world is very different from the way you're understanding it right now.
Can I just comment on this, please? So I just want to mention two things. In addition to that example that we're just given, I think also there is here a very strong case for solution journalism, constructive journalism, because there is, in most cases, we all have very similar problems. So if you want to hear about, you know, how, I don't know, in Nigeria they managed to solve a problem, or the efforts to boost, to help farmers, you know, or the use of solar power, or how in this group in Tunisia is protecting women who went through sexual harassment or whatever, sexual violence. So, because we like to learn from the experiences of others, because then you can say, oh, that's something that for example, if there's a story in Tunisia, oh, there's something that we also have in Egypt. So maybe we can replicate this model. So there is also, I do think there is appetite for learning from local experience, in addition, of course, to understanding the context. And by the way, in Egypt, we have a very similar case where hepatitis C was actually started because of also a vaccine. So when people are hesitant, and also it's related to the fact that only medical news, or hospitals and medical news are always on the news when there is medical mistakes. So there is this, you know, there's lack of trust. Like, how would I trust that this vaccine that hasn't been, you know, still new, I don't want to start it. So but I also want to say there is a business case for this. I don't want to discount the fact, why are we discounting? No, yeah, I know, but that's fine.
Because he wants to focus on the moral case, you want to make the business case.
No, it's not just that, but why not? If that will get some media, if your talk will get some players to say, yes, we want to do it. If the business case will get the buy-in from others, I'm all for it. Whatever it takes to get people to change their practices. But it's true, there is a business case. Why are we discounting this whole market? Like, for example, in our case, Middle East and Africa. Why are we assuming that no one in the Middle East and Africa would be willing to pay for news if they feel represented, if they feel reflected, if they feel that this is insightful, etc.? Why are we just discounting this market? Asia is a huge market.
So can I just share, this is a business case.
Okay, but we've got very few minutes left and at least one question, so
real quick. This is, I think, a really important data point, part of this US audience research that we did recently. So in a side-by-side comparison of parachute journalism and local journalism, 88% of readers said they preferred local reporters because the context, unique access, and human-centered detail around the local journalist that was used was preferred.
Which Americans were you surveying?
And, you know, we went into this research thinking, great, we're going to find out America's racist. Got it. Wonderful, you know?
And I'm not interested in the business case for diversity. I'm interested in the business case for better journalism. And we get better journalism.
We get better informed. People are literally telling us
You have to stand up and interject, otherwise these guys are never going to stop talking. As an Italian journalist, am I?
Based in Brussels.
Okay.
I work for Euractiv. And the other question is a bit of provocation because, all of you passed or are from the Anglo-Saxon standard that it's, I say it with a lot of frustration because to enter university I have to do the IELTS like 6 times because I had the problem of the standard, not because I'm stupid, but because I think the standard for me was really struggling and it still is. So can we challenge also these standards, the idea of going to UK or US university to have open, or also UK and US journalistic standards?
Maybe I can take, thank you, one more question if there is. Yes.
Thank you for the discussion. I'm
A lot of
Sorry.
There are certain structural problems, right? The other media in exile, but many media in exile that I've seen, they have directors that are either like, they're Western directors because they can't get the money, and we can't get the money if we become directors. So what should we do? Like,
Okay, so finding local sources and journalists, questioning that the West sets the standard for quality international journalism, and then this dynamic of even if you do have more representative media, they're still run by Westerners because somehow they know best. And then any last final thoughts?
I mean, I'll just speak to, because then people can cover other things. I'll speak to that idea of finding people to speak to, because that's kind of what I do as a community organizer, right? And I don't want to get into the kind of whole case study thing. I want to make a bigger point, which is to build trust, we have to do trustworthy things. And journalism is not doing trustworthy things. And so actually, it's not about finding something when you have a story. It's about showing up before there ever is a story. It's about showing up day after day, week after week, doing things when it's not in your interest, because that's how relationships work, right? This is not brain surgery. How relationships work is how journalism works. If people trust you because you showed up for them, like I do stuff with community organisations all across Wales, and I don't always go for a story. I go because I want to do something because it's the right thing to do. But also what you get from that is you find stories because you're showing up for people, and then they start to trust you because you're not doing something that's just for you. So it's actually, I've worked in mainstream news organisations for 20 years. We always get the meeting where it's like, we need to build trust with our communities. Can we do that tomorrow? No, we can't. It takes time, and it's not easy. But if we want to do it, and just very quickly, the Reuters Institute did a report a couple of years ago where they found that only 36% of people trust even the news they use, right? So if we don't solve that problem, we will not have an industry in 5 years. So there's not a choice.
Just to answer your question, I hope if we have succeeded today at any level to explain what decolonization means, I really hope I'm assuming you don't know, if you're covering the Middle East, you don't know Arabic, you have never lived in the... Okay, good. Perfect, which is great. You're putting effort, and I respect that. Then my advice would be to collaborate with a local journalist who's based in the country you're covering, and to have a joint byline, and to divide whatever the pay, because this will be a joint piece that's written together. Because no one, not just you, me also, if something is happening in Egypt right now, and I'm asked while I'm in Perugia to write about it, I will not do a better job than someone who's already there and also have been there, because the history and the context, as the vaccine, for example, showed, you really need to understand the history and the context and the nuances, and it's fine to collaborate. That's something that's good. But just please don't use the local journalists as sources. Thank you.
And just to the question about Western standards as being the example that we should all follow, I truly hope that after this panel, it's really clear that, one, what is the Western standard? Like, we're not sure really what that is. And I think we really need to focus on breaking those traditional mindsets that we have about the Western viewpoint on local communities, and that really means operationally thinking about, if you are in a legacy or a traditional newsroom, really thinking about pay, really thinking about safety and security, really thinking about putting decision-making power, such as a non-assignment policy, into the hands of local reporters. So there's a lot that we can do, even within some of these institutions, to really elevate standards and practices toward investing in local journalism for, frankly, all of us to be well served.
And I'll just end by saying, and I hope it answers both the question about standards and about Western directors. We've all pointed out what we see as the problem in the way things are working. it is up to you, us, whoever sees this as a problem, to build an alternative. And that's what I think all of us are trying to do in our own way. And if you're still finding that you're being held up to a standard that you don't think is your own, or that you are, they're happy to hire you into your exile media but not let you lead it, then create your own thing. And I think what we're trying to do at the New Humanitarian, to the question of standards, is to redefine what world-class journalism looks like. That this isn't like, oh, here's the decolonized journalism, but actually to do great journalism, you have to do it in this way, because otherwise you're not actually reflecting the world. So that takes, as you said, Shirish, time, it takes persistence, it's effing hard. And if we really believe in it, we just keep going at it until we've built up kind of a critical mass of people who understand the need for this, who are willing to support it. So I have put our contact info up there because we do want your ideas. We want your input into this. As I said, we are hoping to kind of collect these learnings into a piece that we can share with the wider community. So do get in touch and kind of help us continue the momentum on this, because I think we are making some progress despite some of the challenges we're up against. So thank you so much for your attention. Thanks to Lashmi, Shirish, and Dina.